Hi, today I'm here to talk about the zero product property. Now, the zero product property, in theory, is very simple. What it says is that any time you're looking at the product of two or more terms, if that product equals zero, we know something about the terms. If you look at this equation, the a times b equals 0, if you tell me that multiplying two numbers a and b will have a product of 0, then I know that either the a is 0, because 0 times b would be 0, or I know the b is 0, because a times 0 would be 0. So, or a third option would be that they are both 0. Okay? So what the zero product property is really telling us is that anytime I'm multiplying factors together and the result is 0, I know that either one of them is 0, or the other is 0, or they're both 0. Now, we have the note sheets that we gave you before we left for distance learning. If you still have that note packet, you could pull it out now, and we will fill it out together. If you do not have the note packet anymore, you could simply take your own notes on a piece of paper. That would work just fine. You'll notice that below this video, you'll find this note sheet completely filled out as well, and you can use that as a reference as well. And if you wanted to, you could probably even print that somehow. But you can refer to that as you work. So if you want to take a second and pause the video and go find your note sheet or a piece of paper, this would be the time to do that. All right, let's take a look at the zero product property. First, let's read the sentence at the top. It says, if two or more numbers or factors are multiplied together and they equal 0, at least one of them must be 0. So if we look at example 1, you'll notice that it says 8 times x equals 0. Now, I just want to have you notice a couple things. That's a product, okay, because that is 8 times x. And notice it is equal to 0, okay? To do problems like this, one side of the equation has to be a product where there's multiplication, and the other side has to be equal to 0. Okay, so that is the setup for any problem like this. Now, in this situation, it's pretty easy to tell the only way that 8x is going to equal 0 is if the x is 0 itself. And one thing you can do is always just actually solve for the x. So to solve this equation for x, we would divide both sides by 8. I'd get x equals, and we know that 0 divided by anything is just 0. So x is 0. So x being 0 is the value that makes this product equal to 0. Because, of course, 8 times 0 would be 0. If we move on to example 2, you'll see that at this product, the first term is an x, and the second term is an x minus 4. So it's x times x minus 4 equals 0. Now, when there's a variable in each of the factors, we will set each factor equal to 0 and solve it for the variable. So I'm going to take x and set it equal to 0. Nothing to solve there. It's already solved. X is 0. So that's one of my answers. For the other factor, I would take x minus 4 and set that equal to 0. Now I would simply solve that for x by adding 4 to both sides. And I would get x equals positive 4. So this problem had two solutions. And you can always check your answers on these. Take the value you got for x and plug it in. That would be 0 times 0 minus 4. And of course, if one of the factors is 0, then that product will be 0. Okay? And I can do the same thing on the other side. If I take this x equals 4 and plug it into this factor, I'd get 4 minus 4, which of course is also 0. Okay, so this first factor over here makes the left-hand side of that product 0. And this factor on the right, that makes the right-hand factor 0. Because remember, one of those has to be 0. So I figure out what it takes to make both sides of that product be 0. Let's look at example 3. Example 3 is a little easier than example 2 because one of the factors, is already 5, and there's no way I can make that 0. So the only way that that product is going to be 0 is if the x minus 2 factor is 0. So I take the x minus 2 factor, set it equal to 0, solve it for x by adding 2 to both sides, and I get x equals 2. And you can always check your answers by taking your solution and plugging it in for x. And notice when I take that 2 and plug it in for x, that makes that parentheses be 2 minus 2, which is 0. And then, of course, 0 times 5 is 0. Now, example number 4, you probably recognize this one. This has been an answer to some of the problems we've been doing lately. When we have factored something with an x squared in it, like we've done on the formative quiz, the practice test, and the test recently. Well, notice I've got my two factors, and they're being multiplied together, and it's set equal to 0. So when that's the case, to solve this, I would use the zero product property. So I would take the factor on the left and set it equal to 0. And I would take the factor on the right and set it equal to 0. And then I would simply solve both of those equations. So on the left, I would add 2 to both sides. So I'd get x is 2. On the right, I would subtract 5 from both sides, which gives me x equals negative 5. So if x is 2, that makes this left term be 2 minus 2, which would be 0, and then 0 times the right product would just be 0. Or I can take the x equals negative 5 and plug it into this factor. And negative 5 plus 5 would, of course, be 0. So these two numbers that I found are what makes the product above true, or makes the equation above true. Now, question 5, or example 5, is very similar to example 4. I've got my two factors multiplied together, that equals 0. So I set each individual factor equal to 0. So I have 2x minus 5 equals 0. And then I also do x plus 3 equals 0. Now, the left-hand side is a little harder to solve than before. I'm going to add 5 to both sides. I'm going to get 2x equals 5. And then I need to divide both sides by 2. So I got x equals 5 halves, or if you want, you could say 2.5. On the right, I would just subtract 3 from both sides. It's an easier solve. And I get x is negative 3. So there's my two solutions. If you want to double check, you can. If I take my first answer, x equals 2.5, and I plug that into x in the top, or the first factor, 2 times 2.5 would be 5, and then 5 minus 5, of course, would be 0. I'm trying to figure out what would make this factor be 0. On the right, obviously, if I plug in negative 3 for x, negative 3 plus 3 would be 0. So what I'm really doing is I'm just trying to figure out, how do I make this 0? And some of you guys are probably smart enough to go, well, yeah, if I put a negative 3 right here, and I add 3 to that, that would be 0. So sometimes you may be able to, skip solving, because you can kind of just tell what the number is, what the answer is. When it's a two-step problem, you may be able to do the 2 steps in your head. I would probably recommend solving that just to be sure. Okay. Let's look at number 6. All right, moving on to example number 6. Now, in example number 6, you will notice that there are no products in this problem except the 5 times x. In fact, there's addition twice. Okay, this doesn't look like the problems we've been doing. In order to do this problem using the zero product property, we need to factor this expression first. And that's what we've been doing in the first part of chapter 8, was learning how to factor this. So how do we factor this? Well, the first thing we would do is set up a generic rectangle, put x squared and 6 in the corners, multiply those together, gets me 6x squared on top. Remember, the middle term goes on the bottom. And then I think of what two numbers multiply to be 6 but add up to be 5. That's 2x and 3x. Fill those into the other diagonal of the generic rectangle. Hopefully this is just a total review. I'd put a 3 here and a 2 here. That means my factors would be x plus 2, x plus 3. So I've taken this and by factoring changed it into this. But remember, that equation was set equal to 0. So I bring that down as well. Now I have a zero product property problem because I have a product. Those are my two factors. So I take each factor and set it equal to 0. And then simply solve. So I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. I get x is negative 2. That's one answer. On the other side, I would subtract 3 from both sides, and I'd get x equals to negative 3. And you can check those if you want. If I plug a negative 2 into that one, that makes it 0. If I plug a negative 3 into this factor, that makes that side 0. So sometimes you're going to have to factor first and then apply the zero product property. So that'll be good practice on factoring as well. If you have any questions, feel free to email one of your teachers, or watch this video again, or you can refer to the note sheet that's below it. Thanks and good luck.